Hey everybody, Greg here at Videomaker. Today we're going to talk about the loop expression in After Effects. Now, you don't have to be an expert or even know anything about expressions to understand this, so just stick with me and we'll walk you through the entire process. Basically, a loop expression is really handy if you have motion graphics that need sort of perpetual motion. So maybe you have something that needs to rotate throughout your entire composition, or you have a bouncing ball, or you just want some repetitive motion. This is going to be a really powerful tool to help you use fewer keyframes and make it much easier to adjust those keyframes after you've got your animation set. So let's dive right in and start with the loop out expression here. Okay, so I've got keyframes here that basically have this quote-unquote ball come in from the left side, bounce off the floor, and bounce off to the right side. Now, if I wanted this ball to continue bouncing over and over and over, I could copy paste each of these keyframes and that will get the job done. But then if I want to make adjustments later, if I want to speed up or slow down the speed of the ball, I'm going to have to basically adjust these 3 keyframes, delete all the rest, and then repaste them. And then if I want to make more adjustments, I'm going to have to rinse and repeat that process. So we don't want to do it that way. What we want to do is add an expression. So I actually have the expression added in here already. So I'm just going to show you what it does by activating it. Now this equals with a slash sign through it will either turn on or turn off an expression on a layer. So right now I'm just going to turn this on so that we can see what it does. So I'm going to render that. Okay, and once it's rendered, you can basically see it's basically going to just repeat the action from the beginning to the end keyframe. So once it gets to the last keyframe in the sequence, it just goes right back to keyframe 1 and starts repeating it. Now this obviously works because it starts off screen and it ends off screen. So if I were to change my beginning keyframe here, I'm going to turn off the expression and I'm going to go ahead and just move this to where it starts on, and I'm going to turn the expression back on. Now watch what happens. So now, even though it bounces off, it actually starts, if you watch here frame by frame, it basically pops right on. So not necessarily the best version of this cycle version. So you want to make sure that if this is going to be used, that you're not having, items just pop automatically onto the screen. So, okay, now the beauty again here is, let's say we wanted to, actually I'm going to undo bringing this guy on. So what if we wanted it to be slower overall? So I'm going to stretch this guy out and I'm going to stretch that guy out. Actually, I'm going to do it quite a bit just for dramatic purposes. This is going to be a very slow moving ball. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the expression back on and then I'm going to render it. Okay, so now that it's rendered, you can see, oh, we've got this ultra slow motion bounce. But look at what happened. Every instance and repeat of that is now slowed down. So with just moving 2 keyframes, I've slowed down this entire animation for as long as my layer lasts. Now when I get to the end of the layer, boop, it pops off. So all I would need to do to extend the animation is extend the layer and it'll keep going until basically that layer ends. So now again, there's a loop out and a loop in version of the function. And so the loop out will basically start where your keyframes begin, and then after those keyframes are finished, it'll just keep repeating it after. So if I were to slide these down, let's see here. If I were to slide these keyframes down further in the timeline, it's just going to wait until it gets those keyframes to start the animation, and then it'll repeat it after until the layer ends. So let's see how we actually apply this. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this. I'm going to delete that. Okay. So if I have my position keyframe set first, so I basically design my little bounce here, and let's go ahead and make it a little faster again. So we've got our little bounce here and we want it to repeat. What you do is you hold down the Alt key on your keyboard and then you click the stopwatch for the parameter that you want to add the expression to. Now this could be added to scale, rotation, position, just about anything. So when I do that, it basically gives me this expression, and it basically is now tying these values to what this is. Now by default it doesn't do anything, it just puts this in and says do whatever the keyframes say to do. But what I want to do is, rather than trying to type in this expression and memorize it, I'm actually going to go right here to this triangle, which is our expression language menu. I'm going to pull that up and go to property, and I'm going to go to loop out, loop out type equals cycle, number of keyframes equals 0. That's all fancy language for repeat this in perpetuity after you see these keyframes. So now it bounces and it keeps going and going and going and going. Okay, so now you can hand type this in, and actually if you just type loop out parentheses and just put cycle, by default, it will just repeat forever and ever and ever. And we're going to get into what these num keyframes command does later. All right, now let's get to our loop in. So that was the loop out. Now, this basically functions the exact same way. So let's just scroll through without our expression on, and we still have our little bounce. And now let's take a look. Everything else is the same here except it's loop in. So all we did is go to here, we went to property, and we did the loop in type cycle number keyframe 0. Okay? And then we're going to turn on our expression, and let's see what happens. Well, now what happens is it basically works backwards. So when it hits the last keyframe, it's done. But if you move previously, it's actually basically doing that animation before you even hit these keyframes and then stopping when they're done. So obviously with this one now, because of the length of the layer and the position of the keyframes, we start right in the middle. So if we wanted to adjust that, we could just basically move our keyframes until it starts off screen, and now it'll basically start from the beginning and then end when it's done. So this is going to be used when you want your animation to begin and then you want it at a certain point to stop. So you could also, you know, change the layer. So if I go forward and let's say we wanted our animation to start right here, I can just Alt left bracket to trim that layer. And now basically right when it hits here, it's going to go ahead and bounce this ball until it gets to this last keyframe, and then it's going to stop the animation. So if you need something to begin and then end at a certain point, this is a great way to do it with the loop in. So that's it for that one. Everything else works the same. So if I were to adjust these lengths, it will adjust all the speeds of the repetition. So, okay, now let's get to a different type of loop. So we basically are going to do what is called a ping pong loop. So the cycle is going to go from the first keyframe to the last keyframe and then jump right back to that first keyframe and repeat it over and over and over. But the ping pong is going to do something a little bit different. So let's take a look. I'm going to zoom in here at what we have without our expression on. So what we have is we have the ball goes down and gets squished and it's about to bounce off the floor, but then it just stops. So basically all we have to do is design this half of the animation, and then we exactly want it to go backward. We basically want it to go back up like that. So what we can do now is we add the loop out ping pong, and in order to get this, we could have just done this and done property. And what I would do is do the loop out type cycle, and then I would just replace cycle with ping pong, one word, and then enter key. So what that's going to do, if I activate it, and now that's activated, and then I also have this little scale that's kind of squishing it, and I'm going to basically just activate that one as well. And again, like I said before, you don't actually need all this extraneous information, but I do prefer to sort of pull it from the expression language. It just prevents you from making typos. But loop out in quotations and parentheses, just like this, will do the same thing. So now what happens is it goes through that animation and it basically just reverses it, and then it will repeat it over and over and over. So now if I were to render this out, so now basically this ball will just bounce forever and ever and ever until the layer stops. So obviously if I cut the layer off, it would just disappear. So if you needed something in the background that was just doing its thing over and over and over, or you need a little bouncing ball, a perpetual bouncing ball, the ping pong works really well. And basically what it also does is it makes it to where if I just want to make some minor adjustments to how this squishes or how long it stays down, again, I can just adjust these 3 keyframes and the rest of all the bounces forever and ever will be adjusted. So that is the ping pong version of the loop. And again, it's loop out. So essentially if I were to slide these keyframes toward the right, it's going to just sort of sit there until it hits it, and then it's going to do it, and then it's going to keep bouncing. If I were to change it to loop in, it would basically begin bouncing here, and then it would stop at the last keyframe. So just to make clear what loop out and loop in are. Okay, so what happens if we want to only repeat a certain amount of these keyframes? So this is my crude little table, and this is going to be a terrible animation here because the ball is not going to roll. It's just going to slide over. So basically, let's say we needed the ball to slide off a table, suspend with Looney Tunes physics in midair, and then bounce. Okay, so right now the expressions are disabled, so it moves over, it goes down, and it does the little squash thing that we had from the previous animation. But if we just keep this either writing it like this, loop out ping pong, or we do the default, which has this number at 0, we're not going to get the results we want. So let's try it out first. Let's change this 2 to 0. And then let's turn, our expressions are turned on now. So let's see what happens. So it's going to bounce, but then it's going to basically repeat the scaling effect over and over in perpetuity, but it's also going to repeat this first move and go back and forth. And that's not what we're hoping for. So the way this works is this number here that by default is 0, this num keyframes number, can specify how many of these keyframes do you want it to repeat, and it starts basically here with this last one. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here. Oh, I just accidentally typed in my expression. I'm going to zoom in here. If I do 0, it's basically going to just repeat in perpetuity all the keyframes. Now, a 1 value, basically, it starts counting from this last keyframe. So think of this as 0, and then this would be 1, and this would be 2. So really, I only want it to repeat this keyframe, and this keyframe. So again, you basically start with 0 at the last one, and then count left 1, 2. So I'm going to change this to 2. And what that will do is it will play the animation, it'll move that first time, but then when it hits the end, it'll only repeat those last 3 keyframes. And that is how we basically give that delay where it doesn't pay any attention to this first keyframe for the repetition. So it's a little complex, but you know, inevitably you're going to run into a situation where you want something to do a certain move and then repeat the last part of it. So that is how the ping pong works with the num keyframes command with a number in there. So okay, now let's talk about continue. So continue is a little bit different, and basically what the continue does, and you can see here I've just typed it in, loop out, and that's lowercase l, uppercase O, and then parentheses, quotation mark, continue, quotation mark, parentheses. Okay, so what I have here, and the expressions are disabled again, is I have a position and a rotation, and I have 2 keyframes set. So basically I'm telling it in Z space move backward to that far, and rotation wise just move, you know, 1 rotation. But really what I want is I want this thing to just start moving back and keep on moving back until, you know, forever. So with Z space specifically, sometimes you end up just having to push it so far back and you keep trying and you still can't get rid of it. So continue will basically take the speed of a parameter. So in this case, you know, it's got a certain velocity to it based on how much I've told it to move back. And it's got a certain velocity of rotation to it based on how much I'm telling it to rotate. Now, by adding this continue expression, what it will do is it'll just basically say, keep moving at the speed that is set by these 2 keyframes forever. So now it's going to keep rotating and keep moving back and keep rotating and keep moving back in perpetuity. So a really great way to just set 2 keyframes to give a certain speed. And then again, so let me go ahead and render this out to show you. Okay, so it's not going to go all the way, but we're just going to give it a good 5 or 6 seconds to show you that it's continuing to rotate and move back. So let's say I think, oh, you know, I really want it to move back faster and I want it to rotate a little bit slower. So all I would have to do to make that adjustment is, if I want it to move back faster, I would basically move these 2 keyframes closer together, because now it's going to take that original distance, it's traveling faster, and it's going to continue to travel faster. And if I stretch these rotation ones out, which means the initial rotation is slower, now it's going to go ahead and move back faster and rotate slower. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so again, we have about 5 seconds, and now it's basically moving back faster, it's rotating slower, and we only had to adjust, you know, 2 separate keyframes to make that happen. So really adjustable, and it's just a really nice way of sort of being able to just take a couple keyframes and make a lot happen in your animation. So, okay, now let's get to the most complicated version of the loop, and that is the offset. So a clock is actually one of the perfect examples for why and how you might use this. So essentially what this is rather than using keyframes and things like that to sort of delay certain parts of it, you're going to use this duration to do it. So The way that you would apply this is you would just simply go to the expression language, go to property, and you would say loop out duration cycle duration equals zeros. Okay, so I would do that, and then I would basically just change cycle to offset. Offset. And then duration you're going to change based on what you are trying to accomplish. In this case, I'm going to put 1, and I'll explain how I get that number in a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this expression off for a moment so we can just see what keyframes I have. Now I basically have this second hand in this clock, and I have this second hand over 12 frames, which is a half a second, moving 3 degrees. 6 degrees, I lied, 6 degrees. So basically what I did is I took 360 degrees, because that's how many degrees are in a circle, and I took 60 seconds, because that's what's in a minute, and I divided it. So I did 360 divided by 60, and that gives me 6 degrees. So what I want to happen here is I want every second, I want this thing to basically move 6 degrees, but really what I want is every half second it to move 6 degrees, and then I want it to wait a half a second, and then move to the next one. So what this is going to do is going to give me that ticking kind of feeling. So otherwise, it would just sort of move, you know, constantly, and that's fine. But in this case, we want it to sort of have that tick, tick, tick type feel. So what I did is, if I apply this expression, we're going to see the result here. What happens is it moves the 3, and then it's going to wait, and then it's going to go, and then it's going to go, and then it's going to go. So if I don't have this duration set properly, or if I just had it set to continue, it basically just keep moving at that rate, and that's not what we want. So this value, it's a little tricky. What happens is it takes the last keyframe in your animation right here, which is at 12 frames, okay? And then this number represents the value on the timeline. So in this case, 1 would be 1 second. And then what it does, I know this seems a little complicated, but it makes sense in the end, is it takes the difference between these two values. So 12 frames and 1 second, or 24 frames. 24 frames minus the 12 where this ends is 12 frames. So basically this 1 second value is pointing to this part of the timeline, and then it's taking the difference, and that's how long it's going to wait before it repeats this again. So it does it, and then it waits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 frames, and then it does the 12 frame animation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then it repeats that over and over. But notice what it's doing is it's not resetting to 0 degrees and doing 3 again, it's continuing that. So now we're at 12 degrees, and then we're going to move in the next one to 18 degrees. And so if I render this out, it basically will move 1 second at a time, and it will do a 12 frame animation, which is a half a second, and then it will pause for a half a second. And so over a minute long clip here, it's actually going to be in real time, and it's just going to give me this nice, beautiful ticking clock. So again, it's just a way of, you know, sort of simplifying. I know at first it's a little bit tricky and the language can get confusing, but it really, if you're going to do motion graphics a lot, it really starts to help you be creative and save you time in making adjustments to really perfect those animations. So take the time and just, you know, start with the simple ones. Start with a simple ping pong, you know, take a shape and play around with it, and then ultimately start challenging yourself to say, well, can I get a clock to move in real time? How could I do that? Because basically what that's going to do is the next time you run up against a situation, your experience with that expression language is going to help you say, oh, I got a quick solution for this. It's going to be really easy to adjust, and it just helps you streamline your animation. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this tutorial. I'm Greg Olson with Videomaker. We'll see you next time.
Hey everyone, Mike here. We know the Videomaker community is full of great ideas and insights. So if you've got production tips, tricks, or ideas everyone should know about, shoot an email to editor@videomaker.com and use the subject line video idea. Who knows, your suggestion just might be the next video we post. Once again, send your ideas to editor@videomaker.com, subject line video idea.